Hello all and welcome, and I am the MGTOW Philosopher. And in this video, I would like to talk about patriarchy, and if it's real or not. Now, you always hear feminists talking about how they're fighting patriarchy, how it's real, and how it keeps women down and oppresses them, and always has. But does it really? And did it ever? First off, let's define what patriarchy is, shall we? Here's the dictionary definition. Social organization marked by the supremacy of the father in the clan or family, the legal dependence of wives and children, and the reckoning of descent and inheritance in the male line. Broadly put, control by men of a disproportionately large share of power. Number two, a society or institution organized according to the principles or practices of patriarchy. So, if we go by this definition, patriarchy is nothing more than those who are in a position to make decisions for the good of the family or community. That's it. Very strict definition, very clear. Nothing about oppression, nothing about disenfranchisement. No, just who inherited the father's wealth when he died, who were the majority of politicians, and who passed on the family name. That's it. So going by this very strict and clear definition, without looking at women's roles in the country as a counterbalance, you could say that there was patriarchy, at least of a limited sort. Of course, feminists have broadened the definition to include oppression, maltreatment of women, and more or less every negative thing you can think of in regards to how women are treated. However, if we use feminists' own definition to identify patriarchy, or even the dictionary definition to identify patriarchy, we can safely conclude that it didn't exist at all. Let me explain. Now, it did exist in the form of fathers, generally speaking, leaving their property to their sons. But that wasn't a given. I mean, yeah, if the father had no will or anything identifying who would get his property when he died, then sure, the son would automatically inherit. But so what? I mean, let's be honest. How many people alive in the world today are really concerned about what their mother or father will leave them when they die? I personally could give a shit, nor could most people alive today. After all, people don't shape and live their lives based on what they may or may not get from their parents when their parents die. And people today have a hell of a lot more on average than people did in the past. Meaning people on average probably could have given two shits what their parents did with their property when they died. So, in my opinion, this was no big deal, unless you had wealthy parents, of course. And there were less of them in the past also, that being wealthy people. So I don't see this as being a big game changer in regards to the lives of men and women. Also, a parent could write a will and leave property to their daughters if they wanted, something that would happen automatically if the family had no male sons. So I don't see this as being some major issue in terms of enfranchising or disenfranchising women in the past. Hence, this small aspect of so-called patriarchy is, in my mind, a red herring and seems more of a sticking point that feminists tried to use to advance their own agenda more than anything else. However, it's really a non-issue in my mind. Next, we get to political power. Okay, yes, there was a time in Western history when women, generally speaking, didn't hold political office. This was simply because no one would vote for them. And of course, women didn't have the vote anyway. However, that to me was a good thing. After all, women cannot control their passions, and they're highly irrational. They didn't vote, nor have they, or did they, earn the right, meaning privilege, to do so. Given that women have never been required to sacrifice their lives for their country, there's really no need to discuss this point in terms of patriarchy. After all, arguing that someone has a privilege simply because they breathe air, to me, seems more akin to circular reasoning than anything else. Essentially, I breathe, so I'm entitled to shit. I think not. So let's move on from that point. Also, to say that women had no political power whatsoever in past times, that would be a mistake. Women, by and large, had a great deal of influence within their own homes, as the home was their realm. That said, she had a great deal of power and influence over her husband, and who her husband would or would not vote for. To say otherwise would be foolish. You know, women were not powerless, oppressed beings that feminists have portrayed them as. They had plenty of power through their husbands, and even directly, as they could and would protest and cause a major stink and uproar if they so chose. They also could choose to remain single and get all the property they wanted, if they so chose. Believe you me, they were far from powerless. Now notice that the only aspect of the exact definition of patriarchy that has to do with women owning property refers to who inherits from the father once he dies. That's because women were in no way barred from owning property outside of marriage. Nope, that's a myth. Women could own property outside of marriage. Now, yes, it is true that once a woman got married, she would lose many of her property rights. But she could always opt out and not get married. No one was forcing her to get married. Hence, women could and did own property and could work to gain wealth and property if they so chose. They simply couldn't do that and get married both at the same time. Essentially, they couldn't have their cake and eat it too, something they try to do now and fail at every time. That's why women lost most of their property rights upon marrying in the past. Everybody knew it was a bad idea and it wouldn't work. Now, lastly, we have familial descent. Women seem to have had some issue with only men passing on the family name. However, it should be noted that having only one sex be able to pass on the family name is more or less a practical matter than anything else. After all, if a woman married a man and the woman were the only one who was able to pass down the family name, then families with only boy children would die out. Yes, the same would be true of families that had only female children if it's a man that passes down the family name, but having men be the only ones who could pass on the family name served a purpose, to incentivize families to have male children. This was a good thing, and still is, as men are by far the more productive members of a country's inhabitants. They also have the ability to spread their seed far and wide, something a woman can't do. Giving the ability to pass on the family name to men, and only men, it makes more sense. Giving it to both makes no sense. I mean, really, how would people decide whose name would become the name of the children when a man and woman got married and both of them had the ability to pass on the family name? No. Passing down the family name through men alone makes the most sense. There can be no argument whatsoever that men, on average, are more productive. If you're going to choose one sex for this purpose, and you must, then it makes sense to choose men. And by the way, this is another one of those small, inconsequential sticking points that in truth is really a non-issue, like manspreading or mansplaining. Some might argue it points directly to who has the power or standing in society, but as we all know from looking at modern society, that is a lie. Women run things, and if you want to know who has the real power and standing in society, take a look at who you're not allowed to criticize. That's it. That's all there is to discuss in terms of the dictionary definition of patriarchy. Political influence, familial inheritance, and who passes down the family name. That's it. That's all there is to patriarchy. And when you look at both men and women's roles, without focusing solely on men or solely on women, you come to find that patriarchy was never a real thing. Women had political power through their husbands, and they could make a major fuss to get their way when they wanted to. We all know that. Women could, in fact, hold property. They could inherit. And as for passing down the name, well, it made practical sense to have it be the man. That's a rather minor point when you think about it. So patriarchy, even going by the dictionary definition, didn't really exist. And women were by no means powerless or disenfranchised. Their husbands, by and large, took very good care of them, and they had their role in society, and he had his. Patriarchy, it didn't really exist as a system that disenfranchised women, because men and women occupied different worlds. They had different roles in society, and even then, women had the ability to do almost everything a man could do if she chose to do so. Now, women, while occupying different roles, did not occupy lesser ones. So case closed, right? Wrong. As feminists changed the meaning of patriarchy to include a whole bunch of other things that aren't included in the dictionary definition. The same way they changed the meaning of words like rape and sexual assault to include a whole bunch of things that before didn't fit into the definition. You see, feminists erroneously viewed different as somehow unfair, and then they viewed unfair as somehow equal, when we were really just different, and men and women occupied different roles and different realms. In turn, they created a narrative of oppression in which they were the victims of so-called evil male oppression. Now, this is where we need to, first of all, identify our terms. What exactly is oppression? Well, let's take a look at the textbook definition. First, let's start with the Merriam-Webster. Number 1, unjust or cruel exercise of authority or power. The continuing oppression of the underclass is one example. Number 2, something that oppresses, especially in being an unjust or excessive exercise of power, like unfair taxes and other oppressions. And next, a sense of being weighed down in body or mind, depression or an oppression of spirit. Now, number 2, yeah, that one don't belong. But anyway, so the second definition, something that oppresses, especially in being an unjust or excessive exercise of power, seems to me to make a lot more sense. But either way, there's your definition of oppression. Now, honestly, governed in an unfair way and prevented from having freedom and opportunities, which in turn is cruel and unjust, I agree with that. However, that was never the case for women. They could do almost whatever they wanted. They had finishing schools for women, and they had some colleges as well. Women were not exempt from getting an education. You could say that society discouraged it, but that was only because people understood it was bad for women to try and have their cake and eat it too, as women try to do now, to the ruination of society. You could more or less pursue anything a man could if you're a woman, and you could own property. You just couldn't keep it if you got married, at least in large part. But so what? Don't get married then. But you're a woman and you want to get married and have kids. Then go ahead and get married and give up your property. Seems unfair though, doesn't it? Well, both men and women can't do whatever they want. That's reality. And life is unfair. That's reality too. Women are in no way singular in this regard. Life is unfair to both men and women. Deal with it. I mean, really, the life and the realities of existence tend to decide for us what we can and cannot do. Some people can do more, some can do less. That's life. Both men and women had to and have to sacrifice some things if they want to have a family. Deal with it, ladies. And that's the sticking point for feminists, really, and women who don't want to actually sacrifice the way that men do. You see, men, they give up their lives and devote themselves to their families. Most of our resources go to supporting our family. In the past, this was even more the case, as far more people were poor and had to work much longer hours. If he had to sacrifice, so did she. And people understood this. They understood that men sacrifice in one way and women sacrifice in another. However, feminists, they don't want to sacrifice anything, while at the same time, they want to manipulate people into thinking that women were being asked to sacrifice something unfairly, as they couldn't have what men had, that being work and a family as well. Now, we can't have both a job, a career, and a family. No. Men simply had a different role, and women also had their role and their work and their family. You see, her work was simply housework, taking care of the family. You see, their roles were simply different. But that of an oppressed versus an oppressor? No. But to the feminist, different meant oppressive. He could have both, but she could not. Of course, it depends on what you define as work. In truth, he had his job, which was simply providing, while she had her job, which was also providing. They simply provided in different ways. In truth, the woman's biggest complaint wasn't that she had to provide, but that she had little choice in regards to how she provided. Essentially, she got bored and wanted the freedom to do other things. I mean, if that was the case, then there was a solution. Don't get married. You'll have plenty of freedom. I suppose women thought that men loved their jobs or something, or that they had some kind of great variety to do their jobs in a way that provided all these different experiences that their jobs lacked. Yeah, right. Or that they were having some exciting lives down in those coal mines, getting black lung and dying decades before their time. I see. You know, sadly for women, marriage means that both parties must make sacrifices. But for the feminist woman, giving up a family in exchange for not being a bored housewife just didn't seem fair. No, she should be able to be like a man, despite the way evolution had designed her. And it turns out that evolution made women the de facto 24-hour, 7-day-a-week caregiver, as babies need breast milk, something else feminists don't like. You know, feminists in truth don't like anything that anchors a woman to the home. By the way, they dislike housewives as well, as many choosing to be housewives in their mind are enslaving themselves. Basically, a housewife has internalized misogyny. And feminists believe that marriage by its very nature is just bad for women because the realities of nature and evolution end up making her a slave to the family and her husband, and that's so horrible. As if he's not a slave to his family and his wife as well. Meanwhile, feminists and women living as feminism has taught them to live are less happy than ever before. Gee, I wonder why. But anyway, I digress. Back to oppression and patriarchy and why neither of them ever existed in regards to marriage in the West. Now, the main crux of the problem that many modern-day feminists who argue for patriarchy have was female oppression, meaning an unjust or cruel exercise of power and authority. Okay, so how were women treated unjustly in the past? What justice did women not get? You see, this is the problem when you start to pick apart feminist arguments and look closely at the core definitions of the words they use. You begin to see the lack of validity in their arguments. Okay, so women stayed home and looked after the kids. A difficult job? 100 years ago, maybe. But now let's look at the man's job. He went to work, slaving away, working muscle and bone to their limit, wearing himself down slowly over time as he worked 14, 16 hours a day, working in dangerous, often life-threatening conditions to provide for his family. His wife wasn't risking her life. She was just breastfeeding a kid and acting as a glorified nanny who on occasion washed some clothes and cleaned the house. Maybe cleaned the house. However, in contrast to her husband's life, her life was far easier. She didn't work nonstop 14, 16 hours a day. She didn't get black lung and die at 35. She wasn't risking her life. If there was a war, he'd go and die while she stayed at home. In all ways, his life was far more difficult, dangerous, and in that way, unjust when compared to hers. By the feminists' own arguments, the only person who was being oppressed were men, not women. However, feminists won't look deeper and see that they had and have it backwards. Oh no. Self-awareness, reflection, critical thinking, that's not their strong suit. I tend to see things in a more balanced and less hyperbolic way. I think that men had their roles and women had theirs. Yeah, men had to work hard, even dangerous jobs, and it sucked. And it was unjust that women got to sit at home and not have to be exposed to the same dangers and back-breaking labor as him. At the same time, he was best suited to do those things. He was stronger, he was faster, he had more stamina, and he accepted that responsibility willingly when he got married. He knew what he was signing up for, and he took it on voluntarily. Now that's the key word, voluntarily. Just by getting married, he volunteered to take that role on. Just or unjust, he made the choice. At the same time, women had and have a choice as to whether or not to enter into marriage. They didn't have to, and they don't have to now. They did it because they wanted to. They did it because they wanted kids and because they were best suited for the role of caregiver and the running of the household. Now, let's be honest, okay? In truth, men are better at all these things, but she was totally ill-suited to go out and work as hard and take all the risks that he did, so that was all she could do. And since she was the only one who could breastfeed the kid, there you have it. Was it unjust, unfair that she was in that situation? No, because her situation was much easier than his, and she wasn't risking or being asked to risk her life. And because she chose that role. She knew what she was signing up for, a role that women have chosen to repudiate, even though they still enter into marriage. You know, this notion that women were oppressed, it's the key argument you hear from feminists to justify their continuing fight to gain the so-called equality they claim they've never had. And since they have changed the meaning of the word equality from its original definition to be more in line with equality under the law than simply whether or not two things are the same or not, then yes, they didn't have full equality under the law in the past. But so what? They were never oppressed. And any difference between men and women in regards to the law, well, those differences were simply because of different roles that they played in society. You simply cannot and could not treat them the same under the law, given the fact that they served vastly different functions. And for societies to survive, people understood that it was paramount that men and women stuck to their traditional gender roles. Otherwise, it would mean the death of the Western world, which is exactly what we see happening now. Fairness had nothing to do with it either, because both sides had to do things they didn't want to do and felt were unfair. However, there was quid pro quo involved. Both parties benefited, and no one took advantage of anyone else. Women got a free home to live in, free food, free clothes, free heat, free everything. In exchange, she got to have a family. Okay? She got to have a family and raise her husband's kids. Now, in return, he worked, slaved, and killed himself to provide for his family. That family included his wife, who he took care of. He gave her all she needed to live, and in return, she took care of him in the form of cooking breakfast and dinner and watching the kids. If anything, it was an unequal settlement, as she benefited far more than he did. After all, working as a nanny would in no way earn enough money to raise a family and pay all the bills. However, even though the man was getting the short end of the stick, he made his choice, and he accepted the arrangement. As did she, and it was a good arrangement too. Granted, she got more than he did, but they were both okay with that. Both parties benefited. Now, oppression implies that there's no quid pro quo, that one side is benefiting and taking advantage of the other side. However, as you can see, that simply wasn't the case. Both men and women contributed to the family, which they mutually decided to create. If there was any so-called inequality, it was on the man's part, as he took far more risks, was far more productive in terms of wealth creation, and worked far harder than she did. Hence, if anyone was oppressed, it was him. But both went into the relationship with their eyes wide open and agreed to uphold their respective roles in the relationship. Him as the breadwinner, her as the caregiver. But that's no longer the case. And that's it. There was never any oppression, or if you wish to say there was, it was on the part of the woman using the man more than he used her. He provided everything and risked his life to do so. However, both did contribute in their own ways. As for patriarchy, that's much the same in that it requires one side having power over the other, but that was never the case either. The so-called society, which is really the only construct there is, this idea that we're a collective of some form, starts at the family level. The woman was in charge of the home, and in many cases, in charge of her man as well. To say that men were in charge of making all decisions would be asinine. In truth, women made plenty of the decisions. They had plenty of choices. They could choose to not get married and instead work hard and earn property and live for themselves, or they could choose to get married and live for others. Same goes to the man. And by the way, this arrangement happened to be what was best for the country and the culture. So it was encouraged. And the man, he had no problem with this arrangement, not because he benefited more, because as I've illustrated, you can see he actually benefited less. No, he had no problem with it because he was a man. Men are strong and have been bred by evolution to sacrifice themselves for their families and for the survival of their offspring. It's only women that have a problem with this arrangement, and only recently. Only recently have women been so selfish that they abandon their role in the necessary and mutually beneficial role of wife and caregiver, while at the same time expecting us men to continue to take care of them. Yet we get nothing in return? No, thank you. Patriarchy was and is a total scam. It never existed in the first place. If men had all the power over the political system and day-to-day goings-on of the country, I think we would have engineered things to better serve us, and not women. If we had a patriarchy, both men and women would have been required to sign up for the draft. Heck, only women would have been required. Only they would have had to go to war. Women wouldn't have been as valued and protected in our society as they have been. If we have a patriarchy, women would be the ones working in the coal mine, while we men would stay at home and take care of the kids. If we have a patriarchy, men would be the ones getting alimony and child support from women, not the other way around. If we have a patriarchy, more men would be going to college than women. More men would be working than women. If we have a patriarchy, men would be getting higher wages. They wouldn't simply be earning more because men, after all, work longer and harder anyway, and they make different life choices than women. No, they would be getting paid more as well for the same work. If we have a patriarchy, we would get the kids. We would get the alimony. We would get the house. We would get child. So, I mean, we would get everything. If we have a patriarchy, it would be women who would get made fun of on TV and in the media. Women would be branded with terms like mom bods instead of the stupid dad bod bullshit. Women would be made to look stupid on TV. Women would be labeled as clueless, stupid, useless, and totally unable to function without men there to guide them. If we have a patriarchy, women would be fighting and dying on the front lines in wars while man sat at home and took care of the kids. If we had a patriarchy, women would be doing all the most dangerous jobs and killing themselves more than men, while men shuffled papers around in some office or stayed home with the kids and didn't commit suicide due to all the stress. If we have a patriarchy, women would be incarcerated as much as men and get the same exact sentences for the same crimes. If we have a patriarchy, women who hit men would get socked in the face, and men would not be arrested for simply defending themselves from crazy women socking them in the face. Talk about female privilege. If we have a patriarchy, men would not be automatically guilty if a woman accused him of rape and thereby have to prove his innocence. No, he would be innocent until proven guilty. If we have a patriarchy, women wouldn't be able to use rape accusations as a weapon against men and get away with it scot-free. If we lived in a patriarchy, women who were proven guilty of false rape accusations against a man would be sentenced to long jail terms instead of getting a slap on the wrist, which is almost always the case. And the list goes on in regards to the benefits that women get, which disenfranchise men. We don't live in a patriarchy, and we never did. The so-called patriarchy was and is nothing more than an excuse women use to escape their responsibilities, while at the same time guilting and shaming men with revisionist history to bind them to their gender roles, a form of actual oppression, as there's nothing in it for a man to get married to a Western woman. Not any longer. There's no quid pro quo with a modern woman. None at all. Women don't want the responsibilities that come with being a married woman. They want to have their cake and eat it too. They don't want to provide anything to a man, yet they still want him to sign up and give her his resources. They want to be free to destroy society by abandoning what worked for thousands of years so that they can try to become like men, but with all the perks of being both a man and a woman. Meaning she gets to be taken care of, but without any of the prior quid pro quo involved between men and women. A very bad deal for a man. We don't have, nor have we ever had a patriarchy. If we did, the system would be set up to service and benefit us, not women. That alone tells you what we really have today, a matriarchy. All this continued talk of patriarchy is nothing more than an old leftist trick of accusing your enemy of doing exactly what you're doing so as to shut them up. In summation, I can say